The Israelites were once a family, a close-knit group bound by blood and faith. They lived together, shared their joys and sorrows, and upheld their traditions with pride. Jacob and his sons journeyed to Egypt, seeking refuge from famine and hardship. They traveled with hope in their hearts, believing that Egypt would be a land of opportunity and sustenance. They were welcomed with open arms by the Egyptians, who saw them as valuable allies and contributors to their society. The Israelites found a new home and began to prosper. But time passed, and the Egyptians forgot their kindness. A new Pharaoh arose, one who did not remember Joseph and the contributions of the Israelites. He saw the Israelites as a threat, fearing their growing numbers and potential power. His paranoia grew, and he sought to control them through oppression. He made them slaves in their own land, forcing them into backbreaking labor. The Israelites were stripped of their freedom and dignity, reduced to mere tools for the Pharaoh's grand ambitions. The Israelites cried out for help, their voices filled with anguish and desperation. They longed for deliverance from their suffering and prayed for a savior. Their cries reached the ears of God, who had not forgotten his covenant with their forefathers. He listened to their pleas and remembered his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Israelites toiled under the harsh Egyptian sun, their bodies weary and spirits broken. Day after day they labored in the fields and construction sites, building the Pharaoh's monuments and cities. They built great cities and monuments, their sweat and blood embedded in the very stones. These structures stood as a testament to their suffering and resilience. Their lives were filled with misery. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he showed no mercy. The Israelites' hope began to fade as they endured endless hardship. He refused to let God's people go, despite their pleas and the signs of divine intervention. His stubbornness only increased their suffering. He feared their growing numbers. He feared their strength and potential to rise against him. To him, the Israelites were a ticking time bomb. Their cries for freedom were ignored, their pleas falling on deaf ears. The Pharaoh's heart was cold, and he was determined to keep them under his control. Generations lived and died in slavery. Hope began to dwindle as the years passed, and the memory of freedom became a distant dream. Yet the promise of God lived on. It was a beacon of hope in their darkest hours, a reminder that they were not forgotten. He had not forgotten his chosen people. He watched over them, waiting for the right moment to act. He had heard their cries, and he was moved by their suffering. The time for deliverance was near. He would send a deliverer, someone who would lead the Israelites out of bondage and into freedom. This leader would be a beacon of hope and a symbol of God's unwavering promise. He would raise up a leader, a man of courage and faith. This leader would stand against the Pharaoh and demand the freedom of God's people. He would free them from bondage, breaking the chains that had held them for so long. The Israelites would taste freedom once more. The Israelites longed for a land of their own, a place where they could live in peace and prosperity. They dreamed of a future where their children could grow up free, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of abundance and blessing. This was the land promised to them by God, a land promised to their forefathers, a sacred inheritance that awaited them. It was a land of hope and new beginnings, a land where they could worship God freely without fear of oppression. They longed to practice their faith openly and honor their covenant with God. A land of freedom and prosperity where they could build a future for themselves and their descendants. It was a vision of a better life, one that kept their spirits alive. They yearned for the day of their deliverance, holding on to the hope that God would fulfill his promise. Their faith remained strong, even in the face of adversity. In the land of Midian, a shepherd tended his flock. His name was Moses. He had lived a quiet life, far removed from the grandeur and turmoil of Egypt where he was born and raised. He had fled Egypt years ago, leaving behind a life of privilege and power. He had killed an Egyptian overseer in a moment of rage and justice. The overseer was mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave, one of Moses' own people. Moses could not stand idly by and watch his kinsman suffer. He acted in defense of his kinsman, striking down the oppressor. One day, while tending his flock, Moses saw a strange and wondrous sight. A bush was engulfed in flames, yet it was not consumed by the fire. The flames danced around the bush, but the leaves and branches remained unscathed. As he approached, a voice called out from the fire, a voice unlike any he had ever heard. It was the voice of God, the Almighty Creator, speaking directly to Moses. God gave Moses a mission, a divine task that would change the course of history. He was to return to Egypt, the land of his birth, the land he had fled in fear. He was to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and demand the release of the Israelites. He was to demand the release of the Israelites, God's chosen people, from their bondage and suffering. Moses was afraid. He doubted his abilities. He stuttered when he spoke, his words often failing him. But God reassured him. God promised to be with him every step of the way, to guide him and give him strength. He gave him Aaron, his brother, as a spokesman to speak the words Moses could not. Together, they would lead the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery and into freedom. Moses returned to Egypt, his heart heavy with the weight of his mission. He stood before Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, and delivered God's message. "Let my people go," he declared with a voice filled with divine authority. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He refused to listen to Moses' plea. He mocked Moses and his God, dismissing their demands with scorn. In his defiance, Pharaoh increased the burdens on the Israelites, making their lives even more unbearable. He thought he could defy the Almighty, that his power was greater than that of God. But Pharaoh would soon learn the cost of his arrogance, as God's power would be revealed in ways he could never have imagined. God unleashed his wrath upon Egypt. 10 plagues struck the land. The Nile River turned to blood. Frogs swarmed the streets. Gnats filled the air. Flies infested the houses. Livestock died in the fields. Boils covered the people. Hail rained down from the sky. Locusts devoured every green plant. Darkness covered the land. With each plague, Pharaoh hardened his heart. He refused to let the Israelites go. He defied God's power. He clung to his pride. He would not be swayed. He would not be broken. He would not relent. The 10th and final plague was the most devastating. The angel of death passed through the land. He struck down the firstborn of every Egyptian household, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the lowliest servant. There was wailing and gnashing of teeth throughout Egypt. Pharaoh's heart was finally broken. He had lost his own son. He could bear no more. He summoned Moses and Aaron. "Go!" he cried. "Take your people and leave this place." Section 4. Flight through the night. The Israelites left Egypt in haste. They had been living under the harsh rule of Pharaoh for generations, enduring backbreaking labor and relentless oppression. The night of their departure was filled with urgency and anticipation. They took their belongings and their livestock. Every family gathered what they could carry, from the youngest child to the eldest elder. They knew they were embarking on a journey of unknown length and difficulty. They left behind their lives of slavery. The tools of their bondage were abandoned, and the quarters that had confined them were left empty. It was a symbolic shedding of their old lives. They followed Moses, their deliverer. Moses, who had been chosen by God to lead them out of Egypt, stood as a beacon of hope and courage. His faith and determination inspired the people to trust in their divine mission. They journeyed towards the promised land. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey kept their spirits high. They walked through deserts and across rugged terrain, driven by the vision of freedom. They were free at last. The weight of centuries of oppression was lifted from their shoulders. Their hearts were filled with joy and gratitude as they embraced their newfound freedom. They celebrated the first Passover before they departed. This meal was not just a feast, but a sacred ritual, a testament to their faith and unity. It was a night of remembrance and hope. They sacrificed a lamb and marked their doorposts with its blood. This act of faith was a sign of their covenant with God, a symbol of protection and deliverance. The angel of death passed over their homes. The blood on the doorposts was a shield, sparing them from the final plague that struck Egypt. He spared their firstborn sons. The relief and gratitude of the families were immense. They knew that their obedience and faith had saved their loved ones. This was a night to be remembered, a night of deliverance, a night of freedom. The stars above bore witness to their liberation, and the night air was filled with the whispers of hope and prayers of thanks. A night of God's protection. They felt the divine presence guiding and guarding them, a reassurance that they were not alone on this perilous journey. The Israelites traveled day and night. Their journey was relentless, but their determination was unwavering. They moved as one, united by their shared goal and their faith in God's promise. They were guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. These divine signs were constant reminders of God's presence and guidance, leading them through the wilderness. They were led by the hand of God. Every step they took was under his watchful eye, and every challenge they faced was met with his support. They were on a journey to a new life. The horizon held the promise of a future free from tyranny, a land where they could live in peace and prosperity. They were filled with hope. Each day brought them closer to their dream, and their hearts swelled with anticipation and joy. Pharaoh, in his grief and anger, had a change of heart. The loss of his own firstborn and the realization of his people's suffering led him to a moment of bitter regret. He sent his army after the Israelites. His sorrow quickly turned to rage, and he commanded his forces to pursue the fleeing slaves. He wanted to bring them back. Pharaoh's heart was hardened once more, and he sought to reclaim his workforce by force. He wanted to enslave them once more. The memory of their labor and the wealth it brought to Egypt fueled his determination. He had forgotten the lessons of the plagues. The devastation that had befallen Egypt was a distant memory in his mind, overshadowed by his desire for control. He had forgotten the power of God. In his arrogance, Pharaoh dismissed the warnings and signs that had led to his people's suffering, choosing instead to challenge the divine will once more. Section 5. Passage through the sea. The Israelites reached the Red Sea. They were trapped. The Egyptian army was behind them. The sea was before them. They cried out to Moses in fear. They thought they were doomed. Moses raised his staff. God parted the waters of the sea. A dry path appeared. The Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. The waters formed walls on either side of them. They were safe from their pursuers. The Egyptian army followed them into the sea. They thought they could capture the Israelites. They thought they could defy God. They were wrong. God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand again. The waters crashed down upon the Egyptian army. Pharaoh and his soldiers were drowned. The Israelites were safe. They had witnessed the power of God. They had seen their enemies defeated. They were filled with awe and wonder. Section 6. Manna and quail. The Israelites journeyed through the wilderness. The desert was harsh and unforgiving. They faced hunger and thirst. They complained to Moses. They longed for the comforts of Egypt. God provided for them. He sent manna from heaven. It was a sweet, bread-like substance. It covered the ground each morning. The Israelites gathered the manna. They ate their fill. God sustained them in the wilderness. God also provided meat for them. He sent flocks of quail. The birds flew low to the ground. The Israelites caught them easily. They had food to eat. God's provision never failed. The Israelites learned to trust in God. He was their provider. He would not let them starve. He would care for them in the wilderness. He would lead them to the promised land.